Darian. There is a tablet in a drawer in London, 4,000 years old, and it describes the Ark before Noah ever had one. Tim, before Noah. Come on, you're telling me the flood story has a prequel? Darian, I'm telling you Noah's Ark was not the original. It was a rewrite, and the tablet proves it. Malcolm, careful, both of you. That word prequel makes it sound like fiction. What we're about to look at is something far stranger than fiction. Tim, Malcolm, I grew up with this story. Dove, olive branch, 40 days and 40 nights. Are you telling me none of that is original to the Bible? Malcolm, I'm telling you to wait until you've seen the tablet Darian is talking about. Then you decide. Malcolm, before we go further, if you're the kind of person who likes finding out what was left out of the version you were taught, subscribing helps enormously. This channel exists for exactly this sort of excavation, and where we're going in the next few minutes gets considerably more uncomfortable than where we've just been. Malcolm, right. Let's start with what everyone actually knows. The flood. Genesis chapters 6 through 9. God looks at humanity, sees the wickedness of it, and decides to wipe the slate clean. One righteous man, Noah, told to build an ark. 2 of every animal, sometimes 7 of the clean ones, in he goes. 40 days of rain, the earth is drowned, the ark comes to rest on a mountain, and Noah sends out birds to check for dry land. Tim, right. A raven first, then a dove. The dove comes back with an olive leaf. That's the bit everyone remembers. Peace symbol and all that. Malcolm, that's the story as it's taught in Sunday school across most of the English-speaking world. Singular, divinely dictated, first of its kind. Darian, first of its kind. That's the claim I want to put on trial today because it isn't first. It isn't even close to first. Tim, here we go. Darian, 1872, British Museum. A man named George Smith, no university degree, self-taught in cuneiform, is sitting with a broken clay tablet from the palace library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. He's translating line by line, and he hits a passage, a ship, resting on a mountain. A man sending out a bird to find dry land. Tim, wait. That's not from the Bible? Darian, that's tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Akkadian, on clay, centuries before a word of Genesis was set down in the form we now read it. Malcolm and Smith's reaction to that passage is one of the best documented moments in the history of archaeology. According to the people in the room with him, he leapt to his feet, began pacing, and in his excitement started undressing in front of stunned colleagues. Tim, he took his clothes off? In the British Museum? Malcolm, that's what the accounts say. He just realized, in real time, that he was holding a pre-biblical flood story, and the shock of it overrode every ounce of Victorian decorum he had. Darian, because what he was reading wasn't vaguely similar to Noah. It was structurally the same story. A flood hero, a boat, a landing on a mountain, and birds sent out one after another to test for land. Tim, okay, but similar structure isn't the same as identical. Every ancient culture near a river has a flood myth. Rivers flood. People tell stories about it. That doesn't mean one copy the other. Malcolm, that is exactly the objection a careful person should raise, Tim. Don't let go of it. We're going to need it. Darian. Hold that thought, because before we get to how similar these two texts really are, there's a question underneath the question. How do we even know the Babylonian version came first? Genesis could have been written down early, and Gilgamesh could have borrowed from Israel just as easily. Why does the arrow only point one way? Tim, that's actually a fair point. Why does it? Malcolm, because we can date the physical clay. Tablet 11 comes from the library of Ashurbanipal, 7th century before the Common Era, but the Gilgamesh flood material itself is demonstrably older than that library copy. It draws on Babylonian flood traditions written centuries earlier, whereas the flood narrative in Genesis, in the form we read it today, was not fixed in its final written shape until a good deal later. We'll get to exactly when. But the clay gives us a floor. The Genesis text does not have an equivalent floor that reaches back nearly as far. Darien, which is the first fracture in the coincidence theory. This isn't two rivers producing two similar legends independently. This is a written textual family tree, and Genesis sits on a much younger branch. Tim, okay. I'll grant the dating question, provisionally. But dating isn't the same as proving direct dependence. I still want to see the actual overlap before I buy family tree. Malcolm. Then, let's give you the overlap, because this is where it stops being abstract. Darien Utnapishtim. That's the flood hero of Gilgamesh. Warned by the god Ea that a flood is coming, told to build a vessel, told to bring the seed of every living thing aboard. Sound familiar yet? Tim. It sounds like someone described Noah and changed the name. Darien. Now the birds. Utnapishtim's boat runs aground on a mountain. He waits. Then he sends out a dove. It flies, finds nowhere to land, comes back. He sends out a swallow. Same result, comes back. Then he sends out a raven, and the raven does not come back because it's found dry land and food. Tim Dove first, though. Noah sends the raven first. Malcolm correct. The exact order is reversed, and we'll come back to why that reversal might matter far more than a copyist's mistake. But the components are the same three-bird structure, testing for land, one bird after another, the last one confirming the water has receded. Tim, all right, that's more than rivers flood. That's a specific narrative device. Bird after bird after bird testing the water. That's not something two cultures invent independently by coincidence. Darien, now you're catching up. Tim, I'm not conceding the whole argument. A shared plot device doesn't prove the whole story was lifted. Cultures trade stories along trade routes all the time without one being a slavish copy of the other. Malcolm, nobody at this table is arguing slavish copy, Tim. Hold that word. We're going to need it too. Tim, then tell me what you'd call it, because trade routes was my honest first guess, and you've already half demolished it. Darien, I'd call it scribal education. This is the piece most people never hear, and it changes the entire picture of how a story like this actually spreads. In Mesopotamian scribal schools, apprentice scribes did not learn cuneiform by copying shopping lists. They learned by copying literature, over and over, tablet after tablet, as a training exercise. Generation after generation of trainee scribes across the region copied out the flood narrative as part of becoming literate at all. Tim, so it wasn't just a story people told around a fire. It was a set text, something closer to a required classroom exercise. Darien, precisely that. Which means the flood narrative wasn't circulating the way a rumor circulates. It was being deliberately institutionally preserved and recopied by every literate scribe trained anywhere in the cuneiform world for well over 1,000 years, across multiple empires and multiple languages built on the same writing system. Malcolm, and that matters enormously for how we think about transmission, because it means the story wasn't fragile. It wasn't one old man's memory that might have been lost. It was embedded in the actual curriculum of literacy itself across the ancient Near East. Any scribe in any city with a scribal school, from Babylon to Nineveh to, eventually, The administrative centers where exiled Judean elites would have had contact had almost certainly copied some version of this flood story with his own hand as a student. Tim, that's a very different claim than the story drifted along a caravan route and somebody half remembered it. This story was baked into what it meant to be able to read and write in that world. Darien, which is exactly why it's not remotely surprising that Judean scribes deported into the middle of that world came out the other side of the exile with the flood narrative reshaped in their own hands. They weren't picking up gossip. They were trained, literate people, operating inside a literary tradition that had made this specific story part of its own definition of literacy. Malcolm. Let's step back for a moment because Darien has jumped us straight to Nineveh in the 7th century, and there's a much older layer underneath it that makes this even stranger. Malcolm in 2014. A curator at the British Museum named Irving Finkel published a book called The Ark Before Noah. Finkel had spent years working with a tablet that had come to the museum's attention from a private collector, a tablet now generally referred to as the Ark Tablet, Old Babylonian, roughly 1700 years before the Common Era. And what it describes is not a rectangular wooden ship like the one in most illustrated Bibles. Darien. Tell them what it actually says the Ark looked like. Malcolm de a coracle. A round boat, built from coiled rope, sealed with bitumen enormous. The measurements on the tablet describe something with the footprint of roughly 2/3 of an acre. Not a long wooden ark with a pointed bow, a gigantic circular reed and rope vessel floating like an enormous woven basket. Tim, that is nothing like the ark I was shown in picture books. Malcolm, it isn't. And that's rather the point. If this were one fixed, divinely dictated design handed down once, why does the earliest known version describe an entirely different shape of boat? Darien. Because it wasn't fixed. It was a story passed hand to hand, tablet to tablet, culture to culture, and every retelling reshaped the details to fit the technology and the world of the people retelling it. The plot survived. The architecture didn't. Tim, okay, but wait, back up. Before we go further into the ark's shape, I want to know something more basic. How do we know the tablet Finkel worked on isn't itself just a fluke, a one-off? One tablet doesn't make a tradition. Malcolm A.A., very fair demand for evidence, and it happens to have an answer. But the answer takes us back even further than the Ark Tablet. Darien, because the Ark Tablet isn't the beginning either. It's a copy of a still older text called the Atrahasis Epic, full Old Babylonian tablets with a colophon dating to the reign of King Ammi-Saduqa, roughly the 1640s to 1620s before the Common Era. And Atrahasis itself is drawing on an even older Sumerian flood hero tradition, a figure named Ziusudra, composed around 2300 years before the Common Era. Tim, wait. So we're not talking about one older story, we're talking about a chain. Darien, a chain that runs Ziusudra to Atrahasis to the Ark Tablet to Gilgamesh Tablet 11, and only then, a full millennium or more downstream, to the flood narrative we now call Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Malcolm takes 1,000 years. That is not a rounding error. That is not. These cultures happen to write similar things around the same time. That is a millennium of transmission, reworking, and retelling before the version we know as Noah's flood was ever put into the form of the text sitting in front of you. Tim, I need a second with that. Malcolm, take it. Tim, because if the Sumerian version is from 2300 years before the Common Era, and Genesis in its written form is, what? When does Genesis actually get written down? Darian. We're getting there. But sit with the number first. 1,000 years minimum of a story circulating through Mesopotamian scribal culture before a version of it becomes scripture for the Israelites. That's not an ancient culture borrowed a loose motif. That's the story had ancestors, and we can name them. Tim, I came into this thinking the flood story was old. I didn't think it had effectively a family tree with a paper trail going back 2 millennia before Israel even existed as a distinct people. Malcolm, neither did most of the congregation I sat in for 43 years, Tim. Neither did I, for most of my life. Nobody said the word Gilgamesh from that pulpit. Not once, in over 4 decades. I only noticed the silence after I'd left the university and had the time to ask why. Darian. Say more about that. Why would nobody say it? Malcolm, because Durham, where I did my doctorate, required us to read Gilgamesh and Atrahasis as background material for the seminars on source criticism. It was standard scholarship. Every theology student who goes through a serious program encountered this. It isn't secret in the academy. It is simply never repeated from the pulpit to the people in the pews. Tim, why not, if it's standard and known? Malcolm, that is the more interesting question, and I don't think the answer is a conspiracy. I think most clergy genuinely believe the parallel undermines faith rather than deepens it, so they leave it out as a kindness. I used to think that was reasonable. I no longer do. Tim, why the change? Malcolm. Because leaving it out doesn't protect the faith. It just means the shock arrives later. Alone. Usually from a stranger on the internet, instead of from someone who could have walked you through what the parallel actually means. Darian. Which is exactly what we're doing right now. So let's keep walking through it because there's a piece we haven't touched yet, and it's the piece that changes what this entire comparison is actually about. Malcolm, before we get to that piece, because it is, genuinely, the heart of this whole video, a brief pause. If this kind of close reading, primary sources held up against each other, is useful to you, the super thanks option beneath this video goes directly toward the archival access that makes videos like this possible. Facsimiles of these tablets are not cheap to consult properly, and every contribution changes what we can dig into next. You are not simply watching this, you're underwriting the next excavation. Darian Wright. So, here is the piece that actually matters. And it's not the bird sequence, and it's not the shape of the boat. It's why the flood happens at all. Tim, I assume that part at least was the same. Humanity misbehaves. A god decides to act. Darian, read the Babylonian motive again, carefully. In Atrahasis, the gods send the flood because humanity has multiplied so much and grown so noisy that the god Enlil cannot sleep. The flood is sent to grant the gods some peace and quiet. That is the stated reason. Noise. Tim, noise. That's almost comic. The flood happens because a god is annoyed by a racket. Malcolm, it is a very old, very human way of imagining divine irritability. The gods of Atrahasis are not moral judges. They're closer to short-tempered landlords. Darian, now put Genesis chapter 6 next to it. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That is not noise. That is a moral verdict, corruption, violence, a God who judges intention and behavior, not volume. Tim, so the plot is inherited, but the motive is completely rebuilt. Malcolm 6 precisely. There's a careful piece of comparative scholarship from the 1940s that laid this out line by line, setting the Gilgamesh epic against the Old Testament in painstaking detail. Its conclusion wasn't Genesis copied Babylon. Its conclusion was that the Israelite author took an inherited narrative skeleton and rebuilt its entire moral architecture from the ground up. Tim, I want to push back here, genuinely, not for the sake of arguing. If the plot is borrowed, doesn't the motive being different just mean they dressed up a stolen story to make it look more respectable? Isn't that still, at root, plagiarism with better packaging? Malcolm, that is the sharpest version of the objection, and I don't think it survives contact with what moral architecture actually means in this case. Ask yourself what had to change to turn "the gods were annoyed by noise" into "God judges human evil." That is not decoration. That is a complete relocation of the story from the world of temperamental, sleep-deprived gods into the world of moral accountability. The externals survive. The theology underneath is not the same theology at all. Tim, give me something more concrete than relocation. What specifically had to be invented line by line to make that relocation work? Malcolm, several things, and none of them are small. First, a reason. Atrahasis never asks whether humanity deserves the flood. The question doesn't exist in that framework because the gods aren't judges. Genesis has to invent an entire moral vocabulary to make the flood make sense as punishment, wickedness, corruption, violence filling the earth. Second, a survivor's qualification. Utnapishtim survives because a friendly god tips him off, almost as a personal favor. Noah survives because the text explicitly calls him righteous, blameless in his generation, a moral category, not a stroke of divine favoritism. Third, an aftermath. Atrahasis ends with the gods slightly regretting the scale of the disaster and agreeing to manage human population more carefully next time. Genesis ends with a covenant, a formal binding promise, sealed with a sign in the sky, that this specific kind of judgment will never happen again. Darian. Say that last part again because it's the one people skate past. A covenant, not the gods felt bad. A binding legal-sounding promise, complete with a physical sign designed to be visible to every subsequent generation. Malcolm, which is a category of religious thought that simply is not present in the Mesopotamian material at all. You can borrow a plot. You cannot accidentally invent the concept of covenant while copying someone else's flood story. That has to be built deliberately on purpose by people who already had a theology of covenant they were bringing to the text from somewhere else entirely. Most likely the same covenant language running through the rest of the priestly material. Circumcision, Sabbath, the whole architecture of Israelite law. Darian put it even more bluntly. In the Babylonian version, humanity did nothing wrong. It simply existed too loudly. In the Israelite version, humanity is guilty. That single shift is the difference between a myth about divine bad temper and a text that becomes the foundation of an entire moral tradition about sin, judgment, and covenant. Tim. All right, I can feel the ground moving on me a little. Malcolm, stay with that feeling. Don't rush past it. Tim. It's not that I think you're wrong about the parallels. Nobody could look at a three-bird sequence testing for dry land and call that a coincidence. It's that if the plot isn't original, what does that do to the rest of it? If Noah is a rewrite, is Abraham a rewrite, is Moses a rewrite, where does it stop? Malcolm. That is the honest version of the fear underneath most people's resistance to this material. And I want to answer it directly rather than dodge it. It doesn't stop the way you're afraid it stops. Because what we're finding again and again is not, these stories are fake, so none of it is true. What we're finding is, these stories were deliberately, intelligently rewritten, so the theology could say something the source material never said. That's not the death of meaning. That is where the meaning actually lives. Darien. And there's a very specific historical moment where that rewriting happened. And once you see when it happened, the whole dissonance you've been feeling gets an explanation instead of just a wound. Tim, go on. Darien. The strand of the Genesis flood narrative that gives you the precise chronology. 40 days. The specific measurements of the ark. Pairs of every animal. The covenant language at the end. Biblical scholars call this the priestly source, usually abbreviated as P. And the language of P is closest, linguistically, to the prophet Ezekiel. Malcolm, which points to a final written form somewhere around 600 years before the Common Era. Tim, 600. And the Babylonian exile is Malcolm. Exactly when Judah's political and priestly elite were forcibly deported to Babylon. Not reading about Babylonian literature from a safe distance, living inside it, surrounded by Babylonian scribal schools, Babylonian temples, Babylonian texts for decades. Darien, that is the contact point. Not a vague, ancient, undocumented borrowing sometime in the mists of prehistory. A specific, datable moment when Israelite priests and scribes were sitting inside the very culture that had been copying and recopying the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh flood traditions for well over 1,000 years. Tim. So they didn't stumble onto this story by accident. Centuries removed, they were living in the middle of the civilization that had been telling it the longest. Malcolm, and rather than simply repeating what they'd been immersed in, they took the story captivity had handed them and turned it into an argument against the theology of their captors. Where Babylon said the gods are petty and humanity's suffering is arbitrary, the exiled scribes said no. There is one God, and that God's actions are governed by justice, not mood. Tim, that reframes the entire thing for me. I walked into this expecting to hear, the Bible stole a story. What I'm actually hearing is the Bible's authors were handed the region's oldest, most famous story about catastrophe, while living as captives inside the very empire that owned it, and used it to write a rebuttal to the theology of their captors. Darien. Remember what you said right at the start, Tim. You asked whether similar structure was the same as identical, and you said every culture near a river has a flood myth, so similarity alone shouldn't prove copying. Tim, I remember. Darien, you were right to ask that question. It was the correct skepticism to start with. But look at what we actually found once we followed it all the way through. Not vague riverbank coincidence. A 4,000-year-old tablet with a specific 3-bird sequence. A documented chain from Ziusudra to Atrahasis to the Ark tablet to Gilgamesh. A dated contact point in the Babylonian exile. And a deliberate, traceable rewrite of the motive, from divine irritation to moral judgment. Every one of your objections got answered with something you can hold in your hand or read in a museum catalog. Tim, I don't have a counter for that. And I've been trying to build one in my head for the last several minutes, if I'm honest with you both. Malcolm, that's not a small admission. Tim, it isn't. I came in assuming this was going to be the tired, the Bible is just copied mythology, therefore it's worthless argument. And I was ready to push back on that framing, because I think that framing is lazy, and I still think it's lazy. But that's not actually what you've shown me. You've shown me a text that knew exactly what story it was retelling and chose on purpose to make it say something the original never said. That's not plagiarism. I don't even think borrowing is the right word for it anymore. Darien, what word would you use? Tim? Argument. It reads like an argument. Like someone who grew up on the empire's most famous story decided to answer it point by point on the empire's own terms and won. Malcolm, That is, I think, the single most useful sentence anyone has said in this conversation. Say it again, slower, because I want it to land properly. Tim. The flood story in Genesis isn't a copy of the Babylonian flood story. It's Israel's answer to it. Darian. An answer written by people with no army, no temple standing, no king on the throne, captives, using nothing but the empire's own literary form to insist that the universe is not ruled by an irritable God who can't sleep, but by a God who judges the world by justice. That is not a culture that lost its identity in exile. That is a culture that used exile as the forge. Malcolm, and that, I think, is why the silence from that Norwich pulpit bothered me so much once I finally noticed it. Not because Gilgamesh disproves Genesis, because leaving Gilgamesh out means you never get to see Genesis doing the single most impressive thing it does, taking the oldest, most dominant story in the entire region and rewriting its soul while keeping its shape. Tim, I want to sit with that phrase. Rewriting its soul while keeping its shape. Malcolm, sit with it as long as you need to. I sat with the equivalent realization about Spinoza for the better part of 2 decades, and I'm still not entirely finished with it. Darian, tell them the smaller version of that, Malcolm. The one that isn't about the lecture hall. Malcolm, since my early retirement, I've spent a fair amount of time in the Cathedral Library here in Norwich, working through their Assyriology holdings, mostly facsimiles. Nothing as grand as the originals Darian has been describing, but line drawings and transliterations good enough to follow the argument. I remember sitting there with a photocopy of Tablet 11's bird sequence next to an open Bible at Genesis 8, moving my finger between the 2 texts, like a man checking whether 2 witness statements matched. And what struck me wasn't that they matched. It's that when they diverged on purpose every single time, in the direction of holding someone morally responsible. 43 years in a pew, and nobody ever showed me that the divergence itself was the theology. Tim, that's a strange kind of faith story. Not losing belief because the parallel exists, nearly losing the chance to see what the parallel actually proves. Malcolm. That's precisely the trap I'd like this video to help people avoid. The dissonance you feel when you first learn about Gilgamesh is real, and I won't tell you to ignore it. But the dissonance is not evidence that you were lied to. It's evidence that you were only ever given half of a very old, very deliberate argument. Darian. And once you have the whole argument, the noise versus the judgment, the petty gods versus the moral God, the captives who outwrote their captors. The dissonance doesn't vanish, but it stops feeling like betrayal. It starts feeling like watching a very old, very high-stakes debate finally get resolved in front of you. Tim, I walked into this ready to defend the story I was raised on. I'm walking out still respecting that story, more, if anything, but for a completely different reason than the one I walked in with. Malcolm, that Tim is very close to the entire purpose of reading scripture as a document produced inside history, rather than as a text that fell out of the sky. It doesn't shrink the material. It makes the material's choices visible, and choices, once you can see them, are far more interesting than magic. Malcolm, before we close, if the Spinoza Archive Library resonates with the kind of close source-by-source reading we've just done, the 5-volume set is linked below and in the pinned comment. It's built on exactly this method, reading these old contested texts the way we read the Ark tablet against Genesis today. Evidence beside evidence, letting the divergences speak. Darian. It's not a shortcut past the discomfort. It's a way of sitting inside the discomfort with better tools than believe or don't. Malcolm, which is, I'd argue, the only honest way to sit with any of this. Tim. One more thing before we go. The bird order. Genesis has the raven first, then the dove. Gilgamesh has dove, then swallow, then raven. You said earlier we'd come back to why that reversal might matter. Darian, we did say that. Good memory. Malcolm. The raven in Gilgamesh is the bird that succeeds. It doesn't return because it's found land and carrion to feed on. In Genesis, the raven goes out first and simply keeps flying back and forth, and it's the dove, the gentler bird, that ultimately brings back the olive leaf and confirms life has returned to the earth. Scholars differ on exactly why the Israelite author reordered the birds and gave the moment of hope to the dove rather than the raven, but the pattern fits everything we've just walked through. Even in a detail this small, the rewrite reaches for gentleness and covenant instead of a scavenger finding a carcass. Tim, so it's not even just the big theological swap. It's baked into which bird gets to be the hero of the last page. Darian, exactly. That's how thorough the rewrite is. It runs all the way down to which bird you're rooting for. Tim, can I ask you both something more personal before we close? Malcolm, 43 years in that pew. Darian, you clearly didn't stumble onto Finkel's tablet by accident either. What does knowing all of this actually change about how either of you reads Genesis 8 now, practically, on an ordinary evening? Darian. For me, it changed what I'm looking for on the page. I used to read it for the plot. Will they survive? Will the water go down? Now, I read it for the argument underneath the plot. Every choice the author made is a vote against the version they inherited. I find that more absorbing than the flood itself. Malcolm, for me, it's quieter than that. I don't read Genesis 8 looking for history anymore, and I stopped expecting it to function as a weather report about the ancient world. But I read the raven and the dove now the way I'd read a line an author chose after discarding several others, deliberately, with the discarded version still faintly visible underneath. Atrahasis is the discarded version, in a sense. You can still see its outline through the page the way you can see an older sentence through a manuscript that's been scraped down and reused. That, to me, is not a lesser way to read scripture. It might be the only honest way. Tim, a palimpsest. That's the word for that, isn't it? A page scraped down and written over, with the older writing still ghosting through underneath. Malcolm, that's precisely the word. And once you start reading Genesis as a palimpsest rather than a dictation, the whole book opens up rather than closes down. You stop asking, did this really happen? And start asking, what did the person writing this need it to mean? And who were they arguing with when they wrote it? That is a far richer question, and it's one the flood story answers more clearly than almost any other passage in the whole Hebrew Bible. Malcolm, which is, I think, exactly where we should leave this. Not with the Bible copied a myth, with a much harder, much more honest question for you to sit with. If you knew that almost every sacred story you were raised on was built brick by brick out of older stories that came before it, would that make the story less true to you? Or would it make you finally see what the storytellers were actually trying to say? Darian? Tell us in the comments which voice in this conversation you started out agreeing with, and whether you're still there by the end. Tim, and if you've had your own version of this moment, the one where a source you weren't taught about in Sunday school rearranged something you thought was settled, we'd genuinely like to hear it below. You are not the first person at this table to have gone through it.
In 2012, I spent 2 weeks in the Vatican archives. What I saw there, they never let anyone publish. Spinoza was right about everything, and I'm going to show you the evidence they don't want you to see.